everyone. Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you're dialing in from this afternoon. Well, where I am in Lagos, it is afternoon. My name is Ojoma Ochai. I'm the Regional Director for the British Council's Arts and Creative Economy Program in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm also the Program Director for our new Africa-wide New Narratives Program, which we'll be talking about for the next hour. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll give you a bit introduction of what New Narratives is, and then I'll hand you over to our moderator, who's also a member of our Youth Advisory Board for the New Narratives program, and we'll take it from there. So New Narratives is a program that we've been planning and working on for the last year or 18 months. And it came from a commitment to building new relationships between the UK and young people living in the countries of Africa, which is our sort of bread and butter in the British Council. Increasingly, though, we found that with the rapid technological shifts, with the shifts in the demographic shifts on the continent, and with a renewed sense of identity on the continent, we were clear that we needed to refresh our strategy for how we work with young people on the continent. And so about 18 months ago, we decided to embark on a process of inquiry to understand what are young people in Africa interested in, how are they engaging with their peers internationally, and what can we as the UK's Cultural Relations Organization do to build stronger relationships between the UK and this next generation of Africans. And so one of the first things that we did was commission research to look at the relationship through time between people in the countries of Africa and people of the UK, and understand how those relationships have evolved and how the technological shifts are impacting on how those relationships are shaped and maintained in current time. And one of the things that came out strongly for us was that underpinning the cultural relations work that we do is a real sense that our ability to do cultural relations is shaped by what people think about the other place, and what people think, what we would typically refer to as perceptions, are shaped by narratives. And if you're joining from the continent, you will be familiar with this idea of Africa not being a country, and people outside of the continent actually often looking at Africa through quite a homogeneous lens. And so that research was really understanding if that was the case. And if it was the case, what would young people have us do in terms of how to diversify that narrative and crowd in new voices? And it turns out that, in fact, the view from outside, certainly in the UK of the continent, is looking at the continent not quite as one entity, but still as quite homogeneous clusters of countries shaped by common themes relating to poverty, to famine, to disease, to HIV, which is very far from the diverse realities that we know are present on the continent. On the converse, we found from young people on the continent that when they're thinking of the UK, the lens through which they're looking at the UK is very London-centric, maybe England-centric, and that there was just a lack of understanding of what contemporary UK looked like, how diverse it is, and how there's so many different socioeconomic backgrounds that people are living in the UK. So for us, that research and the consultations that we've done have really strengthened our resolve and led to this program that we're now calling New Narratives. And essentially what New Narratives is trying to do is to support person-to-person connection between young people on the continent of Africa and young people on the UK, so that they can shape their own perceptions through direct contact or through content that is generated by their peers. And that way we will crowd in new narratives about the continent internationally, particularly in the UK, but also crowd in new narratives of the UK and Africa. And we believe that it's only by doing that we can update the perceptions and have a more modern relationship between the countries of the UK and between the countries of Africa and the UK. So that's the background to New Narratives. I'm going to hand you now over to Lucy, who will take us through the program for the day and talk a bit more about further details on New Narratives, what it means in practice, and how we're working with our exciting advisory board of young people from around the continent and the UK to shape our programming and thinking. Over to you, Lucy.
Thank you, Adroma, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Lucy. I'm really pleased to be chairing this session today. And thank you so much for joining us for what I'm sure will be a really engaging and exciting conversation. I'm a member of the Youth Advisory Board. I'm a PhD candidate in international relations at the University of Oxford. My research focuses on the role of international organizations and their implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in post-conflict societies, specifically looking at the Balkans. In terms of the structure of today's session, the conversation between the board members will be followed by a short Q&A session at the end. And I'd really like to encourage you all to ask any questions that come to mind during the course of the discussion. I'm going to hand over now to the other advisory board members and let them introduce themselves. So Ebenezar, I think you go first.
Yes. Hi. Thanks, Lucy, and thanks, Adroma. My name is Ebenezar Wikina. I'm one of the Youth Advisory Board members. I represent the Western African region, and I'm based in Port Harcourt, Nigeria. My work over the past 11 years had been across media and development. My background or my career started in 2009 as a journalist for a teens newspaper, and I'd gone on to write internationally for various media outlets. Currently, I work for PIND Foundation. It's a corporate social initiative of Chevron Corporation, and it's based in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. I'm also a member of the advisory group or the jury of the Association for International Broadcasting Awards. It's based in London. And then this year, I was also part of those who spoke, or those who were able to judge the Queen's Commonwealth essay competition. And so that was a great experience for me. So I'm pretty much looking forward to today's conversation. I'm hoping that you'll join us, and we're looking forward to your questions. And I hope that all of these conversations will help to shape the future and the narrative that we hope to see between the countries of Africa and the UK. Thank you.
We're having a few technical issues, so we will have some other Youth Advisory Board members joining us shortly. But just to kick things off, I wanted to ask a question to Adroma, just to get the conversation started about the British Council and its positionality in relation to new narratives. So given the history and the legacy of the British Council having been part of a colonial power across Africa, could you just tell us a little bit about why the British Council has decided to start a program like New Narratives and what's the driving force behind it? And also, what are you hoping to achieve with the program?
Thank you, Lucy. So you're right that the British Council cannot be divorced from Britain's history with many of the countries of the continent. And we recognize every day in our work, whether we're working in arts and culture, or we're working in education, or working in supporting English language or language around the continent. What has been increasingly apparent to us is that the world is very different in 2021 from what it was in 1934 when the British Council was first started. And so I'll start from that historical sort of perspective. Not many people will know this, but in the British Council is a product of the early 30s, when there was a lot of global instability, which ultimately led to the Second World War. And the British Council was founded in that context of a lot of global instability and conflict. And it was founded at the time as an institution that would operate at arm's length to government, be apolitical, and work to create what was termed friendly knowledge between the people around the world and the people in the UK. And it was really a response to the rise of communism in parts of the world, the nationalistic movements that were happening in parts of the world that were leading to lots of, I suppose, insularity, not that different to now. And it was really an attempt to find ways for people around the world to connect with each other and dialogue with each other and almost surmount the sort of national conflicts that were in place at the time. And fast forwarding to 2021, it's a very different world. Those nationalist rhetorics are unfortunately still with us, but the reality is that the way that people consume information has changed, the way that the world engages with itself has changed. But I think fundamentally underpinning that is the demographics have also changed. And so we're in a world where the African continent, with its demographic context, has this large youth population, and there are reports that suggest that a high proportion of the the future workforce of the world will be based in Africa. And so it only is logical to us as an organization to recognize this changing demographic in Africa and ask ourselves if our ways of working and the approaches we've used to do cultural relations and build that friendly knowledge is still valid. And so that's what led to the process of inquiry that I was talking about at the beginning, to say, actually, what do young Africans want? What are their aspirations? What are their thoughts about international relations and the sort of state of the world now? And what does the next generation of the UK as well want in terms of how they want to engage with the continent? And so we've gone through a process of inquiry, and that inquiry has led us to a point where we're saying, yes, the mission to do cultural relations and build friendly knowledge is needed now as it was in the 30s. However, the context in which we're doing that has changed. Young Africans are a lot more strategically aware. They're a lot more aware of their position in the world and the power that they have in the world. And so some of the approaches that we've used in the past will not work anymore. And so we've built through consultation, through research, as I was saying, this program that's looking at three things, really. One is looking at us as the British Council and trying to understand, how do we as a cultural relations organization position for this new world that we're in? And how do we make sure that what we're serving is what people want to eat, if you like, and make sure that we're relevant to both the next generation in the countries of Africa and the next generation of the countries of the UK? So that friendly knowledge that we're seeking to build is actually what we're doing, rather than reinforcing the power asymmetries or the problematic approaches that maybe were fine in the 30s and the 40s, but certainly with the new awareness of 2021 is not fine. So one aspect of the program is really looking at our own practice in our work in arts, in our work in education, and in our work, across the board. Another reason why we're doing this work is because increasingly we're finding that we're more and more interconnected globally, despite the rhetoric, despite some of the similarities we're seeing now compared to the 30s, as I was talking about, in terms of the rhetoric, the global instability. The fact is, in terms of trade, in terms of collaboration, in terms of, just whatever sector of life, education, we're a lot more interconnected. And so there's a role for us as a cultural relations organization to make sure that interconnectedness is mutually beneficial. And it's not one side benefiting from the relationship and the other side feeling used or feeling like the value is being extracted without anything being given back. And so the second element of our work is really looking at an approach that allows us to listen more to what young people are saying, whether those young people are based in the UK or whether those young people are based on the continent, is to listen more and be led by what they want to do rather than what we think as the British Council we should be doing. Hence this youth advisory board that's really shaping our approach. But also in terms of the actual program and its content, which I'll talk about a little later in the event, we see that you will see that a lot of the content of the program and a lot of the activities on the program are really driven by what young people are telling us and ways in which they want to engage. So I think, long story short, the reason why we're doing it is because that's what we do. We're a cultural relations organization. Our mission is to create friendly knowledge between people overseas and people in the UK. And we're working in this way and putting young people at the heart of the program because increasingly we recognize that the next generation hold the power and the knowledge and the sort of strategic confidence that is needed to create a world that is better interconnected, where mutual value is more of a driving force than it currently is. So those are some of the reasons why we're doing it. In terms of what we want to get out of it, what we want is stronger people-to-people connection between the countries of Africa and young people living in the UK. And not people-to-people connection in and of itself. It's not a benefit per se, but we know that those stronger connections lead to better collaboration. It leads to more trade. It leads to more exchange of value, whether that value is knowledge or experiences or just cultural awareness and sensitivity. We're just really keen that we enhance that people-to-people connections, particularly in a digital world, in a way that is responsive to what young people today are actually interested in.
Thanks, Ajoma. It's really interesting to hear more about the emphasis on this kind of youth-led approach and the kind of processes of introspection that are going on within the British Council. I think that's really interesting. Perhaps we could bring in Ebenezer again and discuss. There are a few questions that I wanted to ask the rest of the Youth Advisory Board, but since it's just the three of us, perhaps we can discuss them amongst ourselves, and if anyone else joins, we can add them in as and when that happens. This is more directed towards Ebenezer, but one of the questions I wanted to ask was kind of what drove you to really want to be part of something like the British Council New Narratives programme? Like, what was the driving force behind you joining?
Yeah, I mean, I'd pretty much been part of quite a number of British Council initiatives. In 2017, I was one of the Future News Worldwide recipients, which is pretty much a group of young journalists, future media stars, pretty much, who would be in Scotland for 3 days, undertake a training, and then learn about different theories and practices in digital journalism, meet pretty much some experts and come back home and use those skills to advance their careers. So that's been one of the communities I've been part of. I'd also been part of the Future Leaders program, the Future Leaders Connect program. Even though I'd not been a recipient, I'd been in the community, and so taking online courses and being part of the program had also been very nice. So knowing all of this, when I saw the opportunity to apply for this, it was pretty much it was an easy decision to make, and so I quickly jumped on it, and I thought that it's one of the best decisions I made in 2021 because it's given me a chance to learn more, especially meeting all the Youth Advisory Board members and learning more about the British Council and its operations, especially at a time when the Council is beginning to, look more inward, carrying out as you said, and as a process of asking questions has been very, very, rewarding. It's been a very good learning moment for me. And I'm sure it's been great for every other person as well. Yeah.
Sorry, thanks, Ebenezer. I also would be interested to hear more about, because I'm guessing this kind of featured in your decision to apply as well, your kind of personal experiences around, how you have been impacted by some of the harmful and stereotypical narratives that New Narratives is really seeking to undo.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that almost every young person in Africa Africa is the youngest continent in the world. And so almost every young person in Africa had been impacted one way or the other by any of these narratives. The truth is that the broad way to look at this is that the world as a whole is going through a phase, and it's an interesting phase because all of us are beginning to look at ways we can treat other people better. I mean, through the SDGs, achieve greater things. How can we? There are a lot of advocacy for inclusion. There's a lot of campaigning out there for Black Lives Matter, etc. So it's a very great time, and so I would say that despite all of the discrimination that we must have faced, because I mean, being a black young person, the first thing that people think of, especially when you're from Africa, is, okay, who is this person? What are you trying to do? I mean, whether you go to speak at conferences, I've spoken at the World Economic Forum, at the Global Youth Economic Opportunities Summit, people often, first of all, raise their guards up, and so most times, you in. And so that had been something that I've faced as an individual. And if I'll bring it down even to the British Council level, we've long time, many young people across the continent, especially English speaking, had complained about how they feel about the system that pretty much mandates them to write certain English tests. I mean, in the UK, in the US, and these tests cost a certain amount, expire after a certain short period, and it's pretty much been on for such a long time. And I'm really excited that the new narratives program, is finding ways to highlight this, and also push an internal challenge to the British Council and also to countries in Africa to begin to think about reforming such issues. And I'm happy that if this continues for such a long time, we would eventually get to the point where we have a good landing for everyone. So that's one issue. I mean, besides language equality, the other huge challenges that I'm sure filmmakers from Africa, artists from Africa face. I mean, in the music scene, I feel like we've somehow begun to break that barrier. African music is already, I mean, if you get a sample of 3 people in the world, at least one of them must have heard an African song or an Afrobeat. So that's a huge success, and I think it can trickle down to almost every other sector. Yeah.
Thanks, Ebenezar. Really interesting, particularly your point of language equality. I know that I've learned a lot from you on this issue just through being part of the board. So thank you for that. Before we move on, Ajoma, I wanted to ask you about your experience of narratives and how narratives have impacted you.
Thanks, Lucy. So, yeah, I think narratives shape our lives in so many ways that we don't even think about. So I went to primary school in Nigeria, and when we were in social studies, as we did at the time, the sort of conventional, like everybody knew, we were taught that a Scottish explorer discovered the River Niger. And we just repeated it, like we just internalized it and kept saying it, And that's what narratives are. Narratives are just truths, in quotes, that are handed down and repeated over time until they gain the status of fact. And those narratives then shape the way that a people are seen and the way that those people are perceived. So to this Mungo Park example about Mungo Park discovering the River Niger, as the older I grew, the more I grew up and I started to think about new narratives in the last few years, I just actually started to think about, but how could it be that on the banks of this river that flows through parts of Nigeria, parts of what is now Benin and various other countries on the coast of Africa, where people were living and working and traveling for probably centuries before Mungo Park arrived, how could it be that this Scottish explorer discovered the River Niger? So it's some things as insidious, in quotes, as that seem harmless. But what it does is that it erases a people, right? There were towns and villages and cities along that river for years, but by saying and passing this thing down through time, you suddenly erase the existence of those people, which shapes the way that their descendants think about themselves and think about the decisions they're able to make about their lives. So that's one example. Another example is the narrative perhaps about Black women and hair, right? A few years ago, up until a few years ago, if you Googled unprofessional hair for work, you would see pictures of Black women with their hair, the way it grows out of their head, like natural hair. And there had been a narrative that if you wear your hair that way and it's not straightened or it doesn't look a certain way, then it's unprofessional. And so that narrative that had been handed down and accepted as conventional wisdom meant that if you were a Black woman with natural hair, you were regarded as unprofessional because you were wearing your hair literally the way it grew out of your head. So I think when we talk about narratives, it's easy to think that it's something out there that happens maybe in institutions, but these are things that affect our daily lives. So Ebenezar was talking there about institutional practices, but on a day-to-day, there are consequences for the truths in quotes that we hand down and I suppose regurgitate and reproduce as facts. They have real impact on people's lives. So those are just two examples. I wanted to sort of bring it into the very personal because it cuts across the institutional as well as the personal.
Thanks, Ajoma, for sharing. I think those kinds of personal experiences are so important for kind of emphasizing and demonstrating the importance of a program like New Narratives. I would like to just encourage everyone. I'm not sure if there have been any questions on the Facebook Live, but please submit questions underneath there, and then we will get to them shortly. Ebenezar, if you wanted to jump back in, I had a couple of other questions around the role of the board that we could discuss. I would be really interested to hear what you think some of the most important contributions of the board have been so far.
Yes, so I would say that, first of all, I'd like to congratulate the British Council for being vulnerable enough to involve young people in a project that, concerns young people, because definitely getting young people on this project would mean we'll come with our passions, with our various questions and energy and repetitive emails, and just making sure that, we get our thoughts and our feelings through. So it's been really great working so far with Ajoma and Linda and all of the team and all the advisory board members, just to, set things up. Quite a lot of work has gone into the program. That's what people out there need to know. It's not just a program that started, today or yesterday. There's been a lot of work for over a year, just putting things into perspective. For the Youth Advisory Board, besides our regular meetings and conversations on various aspects of the program, it's also been a great chance for us to learn more about each other. I mean, Lucy mentioned the opportunity to learn more about Nigerians and English-speaking Africans and the exams they have to write and stuff like that. It's also been a great chance to learn about the work each person is doing. There's so many young people out there who are doing great work in various countries, and this board has been a great chance to do that. So regarding the direct impacts of the board so far, I would say that one of the biggest wins for us, I don't know if I should leave this for Ajoma to announce because she's our director, but one of the big wins for us would be that we've been able to advise on some of the aspects of the program, especially as it relates to artist commissions, ensuring that a lot more young people are able to take part of the competition from the outside. There being a video challenge for most young people who took part in that. There being a video challenge that was out there, narrative challenge, very interesting submissions. People on Instagram who'd search new narratives will find more about that. There's also been a new announcement, it was put up today for artists, about up to 10 artists who are able to make submissions and earn up to 5,000 GBP. And that is just one of the ways that the board is making sure that it's more open and it's more wide for young people from other parts, other countries. Ajoma in her earlier comments mentioned that most people think about the UK, they think of England and think of London. And so we're making sure that other nations in the UK are also being part of activities like this. Just as all of the Youth Advisory Board cuts across the continent from all aspects of the continent and all nations in the UK. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Ebenezar. I definitely agree. That's been a really proud achievement, even though we've only been on the board for a relatively short time. Following on from that, Ajoma, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your experience of the Youth Advisory Board so far.
Thanks, Lucy. And just to build on what Ebenezar was saying there about vulnerability, I think for us, it's a pretty obvious thing, right? You would think if you want to do something for a demographic, ask them what they want, right? It's a pretty obvious thing, but not that many organizations do it. And in our history, I'm ashamed to say, sometimes we ourselves have been guilty of, one, either not taking into account the nuance of the place and just taking a broad brushstroke across a country, even across a city, and assuming that if something works in one part of a country or if something works in one part of a city, then surely it must work for everybody else in that city. So I think one of the most important things for us with New Narratives and this board is opening ourselves up to that constructive criticism and saying, here is what we've learned. What do you think? And just really opening it up to young people to say whether it works for them or not. And so one of the early things that I found was, I was talking about the research that we'd done. And the research had taken us something like 8 months. We'd worked with big research company in the UK, working with big research companies on the continent, done this really robust methodology that had us doing youth workshops across something like 14 cities across Africa and the UK, talked to hundreds of young people. We'd analyzed something like 8,500 pieces of media online. So it was a really robust piece of research that we'd done, and we were really proud of. But one of the first things that the Youth Advisory Board said to us was, actually, we don't feel like this research report that you've produced is accessible. And it was, for me, it was like, what? Like, this is 8 months of my life we're talking about here, working on this research. So I think for us, it has been really that learning curve of just listening and acting on what we're hearing. Because again, it's one thing to listen, it's another thing to say, right, okay, if we say that we genuinely want to co-create with this Youth Advisory Board, then if they've given us feedback about whether they think the research is representative or not, whether they think it's accessible or not, then we have to act on that feedback. Hence us now saying, right, how can we hear more case studies of what narratives mean in the lives of young people? How can we listen to more artists, more researchers, more entrepreneurs, and get them to say how narratives are affecting their daily lives? Which is what has led to the commission, the artist commissions that Ebenezar was talking about. And what we're trying to do with the commissions is to say, from the perspective of young people, how have narratives shaped their lives? So that we're not talking about narratives from a sort of theoretical, conceptual background that a person, random young person in Addis or in Glasgow cannot relate to. We want them to really talk about narratives, stories that are told about them, what they represent, and whether they can relate. And if not, what stories would they rather were told about their countries, their cities, their lives, and so on and so forth. So for us, it has been a really vulnerable process, but I think a process that has really enriched our thinking and really helped us really to put our money where our mouths are, right? It's not about theoretical research done by big research institutions on the continent and elsewhere. It's about real people and what happens to them on a day-to-day basis as they're consuming content, as they're traveling, as they're deciding what schools to go, if they want to go to school internationally, that kind of thing. So it has been a real learning experience. From the analysis that we've done, which you guys have seen, we've come some way from where we were and where our thinking was at the start of the program to now, based on the feedback that you've given us. But this is also a very strong departure from where we were 18 months ago at the beginning of the process. Because pre-launching the program, we did do consultations across the continent and across the UK with young people. And when we started out with designing this program, as far as we were concerned, the problem with narratives was something that other people did, right? The source of the problem was other people. But very early on in the process, we were challenged, and lots of young people said to us, actually, you, the British Council, you're part of the problem in a sense. It's like some of the ways in which you're working are reinforcing these stereotypical narratives about the UK in Africa and about the countries of Africa in the UK. And so again, that's difficult to hear, you know, but I think the good thing that I think we've managed to do is we've taken on board that feedback. And which is what when I was describing how new narratives will work, there's a big piece of new narratives that's just about internally us as the British Council. The way we talk, the way we behave, the way we design programs, the way we deliver. We're reflecting on all that. In fact, about a week ago, we've just launched a new e-learning course, which all of our staff in Africa will do mandatorily, and which all of our staff in the UK working on Africa and beyond, frankly, will do also mandatorily. And the e-learning is really challenging people to think about how we, as the British Council in our own programming, need to be behaving to take into account what young people want, what stereotypical narratives are shaping the assumptions upon which we're basing programs, whether we're recognizing the agency of people that we're working with, whether we're working with local actors on the ground, or whether we're parachuting in consultants to do the work because we think that the local people can't solve their own problems, things like that. So there's a whole suite of internal reflection that we're doing and internal capacity building such that we ourselves are not inadvertently contributing to the problem. Another thing that we're doing based on what we've heard is young people have also said to us, institutions like you, so they've said British Council is one of those institutions, but there's other institutions in the media, in the charity sector, in the tourism sector that are shaping or that are promoting all these stereotypical narratives through the work that they do. And so young people have also said to us, you know, there's various other actors like yourselves, British Council. And so part of what we're doing, one of the strands of new narratives is as we go on this learning journey is to bring other institutions along with us. And so what we're learning through research, what we're learning through interactions with yourselves, we're putting that in front of other people that are also shaping narratives. So we've had instances where we had a co-creation lab with 39 young people from across Africa and the UK last year, pre-COVID. We were in Kigali for a week, and then we were meant to go to Birmingham with them as part of co-creating the program. And some of the young people from that program will now be supported to do new projects around the curriculum and how the curriculum is one way that narratives are handed down and stereotypical narratives are handed down. So one group of young people that we're supporting from that are looking at modules that can be used in schools in Africa and the UK to try and bring in new stories and new understanding of our histories and the relationships between these two places across time and so on and so forth. What other project is looking at archives and memory and looking at things like ownership, looking at things like the narratives embedded in those memories and whose perspective of memory actually goes into the archives, and challenging again some of those long-held truths. And that came from, again, young people saying to us, you know, you have the infrastructure, you have project teams around the countries in which you work, but you also need to recognize that young people also have their own sort of machinery to deliver things. So you have to let go of some control and actually put the power in the hands of, you know, young African archivists or young people in education that are based in the UK and not always deliver as yourself, the British Council. So that was a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think there's different ways that we've received feedback and that we've acted on it. But we're far from there. There's still a long way to go because, you know, this is decades of working in a certain way. And so we need to just be open to listening and acting as we go along.
Thanks, Ajoma. That's really interesting. I think that whole process of asking, what have we done wrong in the past and how can we get it right now, is really challenging. And like you said, a lot of organizations really struggle to do that. So it's really encouraging to hear that the British Council is making such a conscious and deliberate effort to do that, and that there's already been, that you can already see that there's been progress over the last 18 months. So yeah, it's really, really good to hear. Building on what Ebenezar said about kind of tangible experiences of narratives, and Ajoma, you mentioned this as well. Maybe both of you could just talk a little bit about how you think social media in particular drives narrative.
Yeah. And I think just hopping up on what Ajoma said about giving young people the power, the British Council as well, through the New Narrative Program, gave young people the power to tell their own stories. So the New Narratives story and video storytelling competition, which of course the Youth Advisory Board members were fully part of, was a proper example of how sometimes we realize that we could also be the problem. Even us in Africa, even us young people in Africa, could be selling off narratives and stories that do not really represent the best of us. And with social media, everything could go viral in a second. So sometimes the competition pretty much just made us understand that we need to take proper attention and care to what we put online, and ensure that those stories that we put out there represent us, in our entirety, fully telling the full story. And as Chimamanda would say, not telling the single story. So the competition was really great. I mean, I for one, as a journalist, I can really tell how powerful social media had been in my own career. I remember back in 2013, I started an interview series called The Stroll. And, at the time, I only had a Java mobile phone with some little time at the cyber cafe. And, I was able to interview over 120 world leaders within 3 years, talking people from, folks at the UN, the Deputy Secretary General, the presiding officer at the Scottish Parliament, to mention a few. But all of that experience just showed me that things could go really far, really fast when it comes to social media. And so I think in the context of narrative, that also is a tool that we can continually use as young people in Africa, young people in the UK, to continue to push our stories out there. Yeah.
Thanks, Ebenezar. Ajoma, did you have anything you'd like to add on that? Or
yeah, I think the thing for me with social media is, in addition to sort of virality, I think what it has done is create more balance, weirdly, and plurality. And I'll give you 2 examples of this. One is, if you remember the tragic Ethiopia Air line crash a few years ago, I couldn't help thinking, so immediately it happened, all of the sort of Western media were highlighting the fact that it was an African airline and implying that somehow the sort of reason behind the crash was something that Ethiopia or Ethiopian airline had done wrong. And as part of the analysis that we did in the research, it was interesting that very quickly on social media, young Africans directly challenged that narrative. Because in the reports we'd been seeing, in pre-social media, it would be, on the front cover of world papers the next day, and that would be that, right? It will be that, oh yes, something else has gone wrong in Africa because these Africans. Whereas on social media, the narrative of the problems with the plane and the model of the plane and the ranking of Ethiopian airline and their safety record, all of that created a strong challenge to this one-dimensional story that, if it had been allowed to just be, would have just been another story of how Africa has failed. So I feel like that's something that social media does. This is a tragic, tragic illustration, and I hate to have used it, but the reality is it means that a lot more people are empowered with a voice, and they can challenge a story if it's not telling the sort of full picture. Another illustration I'll give is I remember when the president of the African Development Bank was reappointed for a second term, the headline from the BBC was "Flamboyant Nigerian Banker is reappointed for a second term." And, you know, again, it's a narrative that has come from, maybe flamboyant itself as a word is, maybe it's benign. However, in the context of West Africa, Nigeria, how it's represented, a lot of people took umbrage at the use of the word flamboyant. It's like, what is it that's flamboyant about him? He wears a bow tie. Is that it? You know, so again, I feel like the social media challenge to a story that's playing into a stereotype of a people meant that the BBC apologized for that sort of headline, and I think meant that we could have a more balanced conversation about the reappointment, what the AFDB president had achieved up until that point, and made it a much more balanced sort of story. So to my point, as institutions, we're all guilty of this, right? As I say, these narratives are handed down and repeated time after time, and we don't even know that we've internalized it, and it comes through in the way that we behave as an organization, whether we're the BBC or the British Council. And so I feel like that's one way that social media creates almost a check and against just a singular perspective based on a stereotypical narrative. So those are just some of my thoughts on how social media plays into this whole narratives equation.
Thanks, Ajoma. That's really interesting. We've had a few questions come in, so I'm just going to address some of those now. The first one was actually for me, which was asking what are some of the stories that I would like to hear more about England, and how has this experience so far shaped my views of Africa? I mean, I don't know where to start. There's so many things. I think on the England front, I think we've also been talking a lot about this as a board, how to kind of showcase different parts of the UK. I mean, it was mentioned earlier that the narratives of the UK tend to be very London-centric. So I think it would be great to get kind of more of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland featured in these narratives, because the UK is so diverse. I mean, it's relatively small, but there is so much going on. There's so much art, there's so much music, so many different cultures around different bits of the UK. And I think London in itself obviously is an incredibly diverse city and represents pretty much, is a global city, but I still think it's important to really go beyond London and kind of highlight all of the interesting kind of, particularly because this is an arts focused program, all the arts that are going on outside of London. I think the other thing that I would really like to do is I would like the UK's efforts. I mean, the UK has a long way to go, but I have to say, I think in recent years, there's been more kind of attention paid to some of the systems and structures that are so problematic in our society. And I think that there are more efforts to address issues like racism and elitism, which I know were brought up in the New Narratives research, that really a lot of people in the African countries think of the UK as being racist and elitist. And clearly we have a huge way to go in addressing these issues, but I think it's important to kind of showcase some of the efforts that are going on at the moment to kind of undo those structures. So that's some of the things that I would like to see being told about the UK. In terms of what I've learned, I think really it's just forced me to examine some of my own blind spots a little bit being on the board. Like I said, Ebenezar's issue around kind of language equality and reading up on all the advocacy that he's done around that has been so interesting. And I think it's just being able to see more of what's going on the continent. I mean, you can read, but when you actually have direct connections with people, we all connect outside of the board as well. And we have, I'd say, like a fairly strong community, learning more about, the architecture that's going on through Nahum. It's been so interesting to learn more. And I think really importantly, confront some of my own blind spots around particularly this issue of language. I wasn't aware that this was kind of such a hot topic. But hearing you talk about it, it clearly is a crucial kind of structural issue that really is hampering efforts to create kind of new narratives. So yeah, that's just some of the things that I wanted to mention on that. Someone has also asked, Ajoma, can young people join the board? Can more young people join the board, and how?
So yes, it's the short answer, but there's a slightly longer answer, which is there are many ways to get involved with new narratives. One way is by joining the board. The board is relatively small. At any one time, we'll probably have 8 or 9 people on the board, and it's an annual sort of rotation. So each sort of cohort of the board is for a year. And so every year we will refresh the group. And so there'll be a chance for most of the board to get off and then new people to come on. So watch our socials, which we can put on Facebook in the chat so that people can follow us online and register to receive updates from us and so on, so that they can hear when there are opportunities to join the board. But as I say, the board is one way. Ebenezar was talking there about artist commissions. So we're working with artists to commission them to sort of represent some of the findings from our research, but also get new insight on how narratives affect young people and their daily lives. You can also get involved by applying to that and being one of the artists that we commission from across different countries in Africa or the UK to tell those stories from your own perspective. Another way is that we will periodically do different campaigns looking at different elements that shape narratives to get either people to do research or run projects or programs or create art that address some of these themes that we're talking about. So there's so many ways to get involved. If you go to our webpage, which we'll put in the chat on Facebook, you can register to receive updates from us. And when those opportunities come up, you will be able to apply and get involved. One more thing, actually, that I haven't mentioned, Lucy, is one of the things we also support is Africa No Filter. Africa No Filter is an organization that has been set up by a collective of donors and partners to support narratives about Africa. And so through Africa No Filter and the support that we and other funders and partners are giving the organization, there are also other channels for grants, for technical assistance, for training, to support artists, researchers, to create new content or write new stories, or just engage with this whole theme of narrative. So Africa No Filter is also one channel that people can get in the sort of narrative ecosystem with us. We can also put a link to Africa No Filter in the Facebook chat so that people can see and also register for opportunities there.
Thanks, Ajoma. I had one more question, which I think you're probably best placed to answer, which is how will the British Council evaluate its own internal strategy?
Good question. So overall, new narratives will externally evaluate. And so as a matter of course, we would identify external evaluation providers, if you like, and work with them to develop mechanisms to evaluate the success of a program, of whatever program we're running. And we're doing the same thing with new narratives. And so the mechanism that they will use will be things like focus groups with audiences of our work, sort of random opinion polls to check if there's been any shifts in narratives that people are engaging with following their encounters with us, surveys, critical reflections on some of the work that we've done. So we'll work with this external supplier to provide an independent view of the work we're doing. But in addition to that, and perhaps more importantly, from the beginning of new narratives, we've been very clear that ultimately it's about what young people think. So we just need to ask them, right? And so there will be a whole consultative and iterative process of feedback. The board are obviously one key component within this, but beyond that, we will invite at points throughout the project over the next 4 or 5 years, young people to engage with us and work with us and think with us and reflect with us on whether the things we're doing internally and externally are working or not. So it's quite a multi-layered process of independent consultants working with us, asking young people, and then we ourselves doing moments of critical self-reflection to learn and improve the program as we go along.
Thanks, Ajoma. We've had one more question come in. Maybe you could just answer quickly, which is that I understand the New Narratives project cuts across many countries. Would the British Council be interested in spotlighting Northeast Nigeria, especially with all the dominant narrative being around the insurgency? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely, yes. So one thing I haven't mentioned is New Narratives. In addition to all of these campaigns and new things we're doing, we're also looking at our sort of business as usual, in quotes. And so one of the business as usual things we do is that every year we will give grants to artists to make new work. And what we find, and new work, and share that work with new audiences. And what we find increasingly is that that new work that has been created is being created by artists in the mainstream. And if in a Nigerian context, it will be artists in Lagos or artists in Abuja. But we're saying, actually, as a deliberate strategy, we will start to work with more artists outside of these major urban cities. And so when we're awarding the grants, we'll be looking at things like the Northeast or the Southeast and saying, how do we work with more artists and commission more work and do more engagement, whether it's in creative economy or through our grant system? How do we engage with more artists and creative entrepreneurs outside of these major cities? And so in the last year or so, we've really been embedding that strategy, developing new networks, and trying to understand who the key players in all these sectors outside of the main cities are. So yes, is the short answer. People can expect to see a lot more support by us for projects in Kano, in Kaduna, but also in places like the Northeast, where, as the person asking has rightly said, the dominant narrative is of the insurgency, but there's a lot of interesting art and music and fashion that's coming out of those sectors. So yes, you can expect to see more of that focus.
Thanks, Ajoma. We're reaching the end of our time. So do either of you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to finish on?
Yeah, just to say, of course, a big thank you to the council for all of the work, especially around engaging young people on the continent. And of course, just to say that the conversation doesn't end here. I'm sure we can continue the conversation online. So using the hashtag new narratives, I'm sure we can continue discussing the various key issues, especially the issue of language proficiency, which is something that is now really, really hot. So using hashtag reform IELTS policy, we're having constant conversations about this online. So do well to join us. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, just to say, this is only the beginning. New Narratives is planned as a 5-year program, and we're just at the beginning of it. The narratives that shape the perceptions we have today are narratives that have been shaped over decades and centuries. And so they will not be undone in one sort of program or one short space of time. So it's really just to say this is just the beginning. The British Council is one institution. There's many more institutions like Africa No Filter, as I've mentioned, that are doing really exciting work in this space. And I suppose just to end with an invitation that while institutions have a role to play, individuals have a role to play as well in the way that we talk about our communities, in the way that we talk about the societies in which we live. And so just really invite people to really be conscious of how we present the realities of the place in which we're living, and to be conscious that one story, as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie would say, is not the only story. And so just to keen that people share more complete stories in their spheres of influence, and to say thank you to yourselves, to other members of the board, and to the people watching on Facebook or elsewhere for their time and for joining us today.
Thanks, Ajoma. It's been such a pleasure to be in conversation with you both today. This has already been such a wide-ranging discussion, and I'd also like to take this opportunity to say that we have a couple of more in conversation sessions coming up, which I'm sure will be publicized around the British Council social media. So please do look out for those. So yeah, I think we'll wrap up the conversation now. I'd like to thank everyone again for their time, and thank you to the audience also for attending and also your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.